Welcome to another Human Read audiobook by the United Marxist Pact Discord server. Link below in the description. In this series, we continue our investigation into the initial construction, the organizational structure, the principles and tactics of the form of worker organization capable of seizing political power and establishing the revolutionary proletarian dictatorship communality, which can in turn produce a communist mode of production through the shared class interests of the workers of the entire world. Our goal is to compile, analyze, and elaborate on what all these texts have to say about this. To the end, have a strong understanding of the exact scientific process of this, particularly in general terms. At the end of our readings as a whole, we will try to put it all together and present it as a coherent whole, an educational video with associated notations. Today's reading will be on the 1924 Third Communist International's Fifth Congress, with the particular reading being the Report on Fascism by the Left of the Communist Party of Italy. This is after fascism had successfully taken power and solidified itself. And it's distinct from the previous writing on fascism, which is right after fascism had taken power. This is again a speech by Bordiga, presented by him. So we have a pre-written textual analysis on the terms of the aforementioned topics, which is also posted in the pinned comment if you prefer to read it in text, or follow the link in the description to a read-only version of my Google Docs notes. This will summarize the contents of the text, but is no replacement for the actual reading itself for the sake of understanding the context. Especially in this case, because this isn't specifically about the things that we are talking about. So there's a lot of information that isn't being addressed. In addition, in reading, I supply my own commentary, critiques, additions, etc., which may be helpful for understanding some particularities. So, for our reading, in this text, the writer explains how the party should respond to fascism and the various movements struggling against it. First, they understand fascism as a modern and sophisticated counteroffensive by the bourgeoisie, which seeks to gain support of sections of the proletarian masses through the acceptance and creation of fascist workers' economic organizations, liquidating a portion of the proletariat and petite bourgeoisie in order to unify the rest against the proletariat as a whole. This demonstrates the vulnerability of reformist and economic organs of struggle, which creates fertile ground for class collaborationism. Thus, the only real struggle against fascism can ever be the proletariat who resists fascism with class consciousness, recognizing it as its class enemy, with the revolutionary proletariat understanding that the growth of fascism must be met on the ground, in the streets, in direct national and international action to oppose it, that ultimately only the dictatorship of the proletariat can fully stamp out this new method of bourgeois organization. However, because the bourgeois opposition to fascism can only ever understand it as legal, moral matter aimed at restoring social order even against its own class allies, it will not ever truly support the working class taking the kinds of direct action necessary to defeat fascism. Because of this, the party must show the difference between it and bourgeois anti-fascist groups, so that the proletariat understand the need of the liquidation of social democratic currents. To that end, our tactics must be based on practical measures of taking the offensive against fascism, so that the proletariat, which reaches the proletarian masses who recognize the threat of fascism and desires direct action against it. Through such an offensive, social democratic anti-fascist groups will lose the masses, as they recognize our leadership as effective, while the social democrats as not. These practical measures need to join the masses, both urban and rural, together for revolutionary action under the leadership of the Communist Party, which in turn requires the independence of the party, which allows for direct struggle with fascism, and the combating of bourgeois illusions which lead to defeatism. Proletarian masses must be united by the party, which requires the centralization of the party. Ultimately, the only real fight against fascism is that of the national and international revolutionary proletariat, which must boycott and engender a class hatred for fascism and use that to organize an international proletarian counteroffensive against the bourgeoisie in common disgust and fear. And now I will begin the full audiobook reading. I hope you enjoyed the session and will attend next time as well. Welcome back to another reading session for United Marxist Pact. We are continuing our investigations into a working organization that can bring about the dictatorship of the proletariat. Today we will be going over a report on fascism by the left of the Communist Party of Italy. This is in the 5th Congress 23rd session on July 2nd of 1924, the 3rd International. Alright, let's get started. At the 4th Congress, it is well known I made a report on fascism at a decisive turning point in history of fascism in Italy. Our delegation left Italy to be here on the day before Mussolini took power. Today I need to speak about the matter a second time, and again at a crucial turning point in the development of fascism, prompted, as you know, by the Matteotti affair. Fate has also decreed, same as before, that this event should occur immediately after the Italian delegation's departure for the 5th Congress. In both cases, therefore, the timing of the report had been appropriate in terms of illustrating the extremely important social and political phenomena of fascism. Naturally, I'm not going to repeat everything I said in my first report about the historical development of fascism, because there are too many other points I need to cover. I will therefore just briefly recall the main ideas in the critique of fascism I made at the time. I will do so in a schematic way as to maintain the integrity of what I said at the 4th Congress. First of all, the origins of fascism. In terms of its historical origins, the fascist movement is linked to a number of groups which advocated Italian intervention in the Third World War. There are many groups that supported such a policy, including an extreme left composed of renegades from syndicalism, anarchism, and in some cases, especially in Mussolini's group, renegades from socialism extreme left. This latter group completely identified itself with the politics of national harmony and military intervention against the Central Powers. It is very characteristic that this group was able to provide post-war fascism with its general staff. Relations between this earlier political grouping and the great fascist movement we are faced with today can be followed in unbroken succession. The day birth of classic fascist action is November 2nd, 1920. The day the event in Bologna, Palazzo d'Acusio, took place. I will nevertheless omit this point firmly from a purely historical character and move on to other matters. Somebody typified the government crisis in Italy as follows. Fascism represents a political negation of the period in which bourgeois liberal and left democratic politics held sway. It is the harshest form of reaction against the policy of concessions which is put into practice by Giolitti and co. in the post-war period. We, on the other hand, are the opinion that the two periods are dialectically linked, that the former attitude of the Italian bourgeoisie during the state crisis brought about by the post-war period was nothing but a natural preparation for fascism. In this period, there is a proletarian offensive threatened. The forces of the bourgeoisie weren't sufficient to withstand a direct attack. They therefore had to resort to cunning maneuvers to avoid the engagement, and while these maneuvers were being put into effect by politicians of the left, fascism was able to prepare its subsequent massive instruments of coercion and lay the groundwork for the second phase. And then it would take the offensive itself to deal with death blow to the revolutionary forces. It isn't possible here to go over every argument that supports this interpretation. Again, what I said at the 4th Congress still holds true. Another fact. Fascism starts out from the agricultural districts. This is extremely typical. The attacks on positions held by revolutionary proletariat starts in the peasant zones. Bologna is a rural center. It is the capital city of a large agricultural area in the Po Valley. It was here that fascism started its triumphal tour through the whole of Italy, spreading out in various directions. In our first report, we gave a geographical description of this triumphal tour. Suffice here to recall that fascism only attacks the industrial centers and the large cities during a second phase. But although it's true that fascist action began in non-industrial areas, we should not draw from the conclusion that the fascist movement was created to serve the interests of the landed bourgeoisie, the large landowners. Quite the contrary. Behind this movement there stands the interests of big industry, commerce, and high finance as well. It is an attempt at a unitary counter-revolutionary offensive of all the bourgeois forces. This is another thesis which I will be hammering out and returning to many times in the course of this report. One should also add, third point, the fact that the mobilization of middle classes. At first sight, going by external appearances, fascism does not give the impression of being a movement of the above-mentioned upper social strata, for example, the large landowners and the big capitalist bourgeoisie, but rather a movement of the pay and middle bourgeoisie, of ex-servicemen, intellectuals, and all those classes which the proletariat has not managed yet to draw into its orbit and rally around the watchword of revolutionary dictatorship. Within these classes, a powerful ideological, political, and organizational mobilization has been developed. Their discontent and their restlessness have been organized. They were told, you are the third class to enter the battlefield, that is, a new force that not only rebels against the proletariat, but also against the old bourgeoisie and its traditional politicians. During the post-war crisis, the proletariat didn't manage to enforce its revolutionary policy and seize the power that was slipping into the hands of the old ruling class. Now a third class appears on the screen, such as the external appearance which fascism likes to give itself. But in reality, it is a mobilization of the middle classes, driven by and under the leadership of the conservative forces of the big bourgeoisie, with the cooperation and help of the state apparatus. Hence, the dual face of fascism. Firstly, it defends the interests of the big bourgeoisie, that is, the interests of the upper class. Secondly, it mobilizes the middle class, that is, the important social forces of the small and middle bourgeoisie in defense of those interests. In my first report, I made a critique of fascist ideology. I asked, what is the ideology on which this movement is based? Nowadays, it has become commonplace to state that fascism has no theory, has done nothing to outline a new political theory. It claims to have accomplished a revolution to give some new face to social and political struggle. In actual fact, from a theoretical point of view, it has created absolutely nothing that could serve to construct a basis for a program of such a revolution. Of this self-styled top-to-toe renewal of Italian society, which, according to Mussolini, may tomorrow be extended to societies in other countries. It is a fact that to begin with, fascism possesses a program that borrows a number of points from the programs of the extreme left. But this program exclusively serves the needs of the mobilization which we referred to earlier. It is quickly forgotten and in fact transformed into its exact opposite as soon as fascism gets into power. From that moment, its program of renewal fizzles out. Fascism is not a revolutionary movement, it is a purely conservative movement for the defense of the established bourgeois order. It does not introduce a new program. However, as soon as we move from the ideological and organizational sphere, we can see that as bringing in something new. We can see immediately that there is something here that the bourgeoisie in Italy and other countries haven't so far employed. Although the Italian bourgeoisie had great political leaders, professional politicians, parliaments who could be assured of great popular following elections, and although it had a great liberal party, its policy used to be characterized by the fact that it lacked any organizational force. The Liberal Party had a clear and concrete doctrine, a well-defined historical tradition, and an ideology that was entirely adequate from a bourgeois point of view, but lacked organization. Fascism completely turned this state of affairs on its head. It brings nothing new in ideological terms. We will see soon enough the worth of its critique of the ideology of the old bourgeois parties. But it does deploy a new factor which the old parties completely lacked, a powerful campaigning apparatus, powerful both in terms of its political organization and its military organization. So essentially, fascism isn't actually really doing anything new. All it's doing is adding jackboots to maintain the liberal order as it was in terms of its actual content. Um, without any of the stuff about freedom and rights and stuff like that at the same time. Those things aren't actually important. What's important is maintaining the private property of the bourgeoisie. So, continuing, this shows that in the present period of grave capitalist crisis, the state apparatus is no longer sufficient to defend the bourgeoisie. It needs to be backed up by a well organized party that is capable of operating on a countrywide level, and which struggles to gain support from the middle classes and maybe even to sidle up to a certain strata of the working class. During this crisis, the bourgeoisie can face out the impending revolution only thanks to the mobilization of the non bourgeois classes. What relations exist between fascism and the proletariat? Fascism is by its nature an anti socialist and therefore anti proletarian movement. Since its inception, fascism has presented itself as a destroyer of even the most minor conquests of the working class. Nevertheless, it is incorrect to identify fascism with the traditional reaction of the extreme right. With its state of siege, its terror, its emergency laws, and its prohibition of the revolutionary organizations, fascism goes farther. It is a more modern movement, and being more sophisticated, it also endeavors to gain influence amongst the proletarian masses, and to this end, it unhesitatingly accepts the principles of trade union organization. It tries to create workers' economic organizations. Clearly, these trade unions bear no comparison with free trade unions. Nevertheless, in my opinion, we must establish that the very existence of fascist unions represents a very significant argument against revolutionary syndicalism, which sees the economic organization as a decisive weapon of the class struggle. The facts show that this weapon can just as well be exploited for counter revolutionary ends. So, I do also want to say, though, that the bourgeoisie has regularly historically made parties with communists in the name. We can look at Turkey as a great example of this. Um, they made all the real communist parties illegal, and then AstroTurf created a fake communist party. Um, and all the people who were confused by this joined that communist party and had all their organizational capacity robbed from them. It was a profoundly and utterly liberal system that happened to talk a little bit about workers, right? So I just want to put that out there that the bourgeoisie can exploit the Communist Party for counter-revolutionary ends as well. Continuing. Of course, the fascist trade union movement is to be distinguished from the real trade union movement by one very characteristic feature, i.e., it recruits amongst the ranks of all classes and not just among the working class, because it is actually a form of organization based on the sectors of production. The intention is to create parallel organizations of workers and employers on the basis of class collaboration. We have thus reached a point where fascism, so basically, it's not the workers against the bosses, rather the workers and the bosses are both in the union, and the workers don't really get to make any choices in the union. It's a profoundly and systemically yellow union. Continuing. We have thus reached a point where fascism and democracy converge. In short, fascism is playing the old game of the left wing bourgeois parties and social democracy, that is, calling on the proletariat to declare a civil truce. To achieve this end, it tries to form trade unions of industrial workers and of agricultural workers, which are then maneuvered into a de facto collaboration with the bosses' organizations. The sole intention of this action, of course, is to annihilate the revolutionary organizations and to allow the proletarian masses to be fully exploited by the capitalists. And yet, the upper propertied strata does not portray fascism as a brutal method of oppressing the workers. On the contrary, it is presented as a way of organizing the entire productive forces of the country, with the recognition of this requirement taking the form of collaboration of all economic groups of the quote national interest. Obviously, what underlies all this is the exploitation of the nationalistic and patriotic ideology. This isn't something entirely new. During the war, the formula of the submission of all particular interests to the general interests of the whole countries had already been widely utilized in the national interest. Fascism is therefore reverting to an old program of bourgeois politics. However, this program appears in a form which somehow echoes the program of social democracy, while on the other hand, really does contain something new, that is, a powerful political and military organization at the service of the conservative forces. The conclusion I drew up in the report I made to the Fourth Congress was that the fascist program was actually based on a fundamental historical and social contradiction. Fascism would like to reconcile and silence all economic and social conflicts within society. But this is just the outward appearance. In reality, it endeavors to achieve unity within the bourgeoisie, a coalition between the upper layers of the property classes in which individual contrasts between the interests of the different groups of the bourgeoisie and the different capitalist enterprises are smoothed out. On the economic terrain, fascism is entirely stuck in the rut of old bourgeois liberalism. It rejects any state intervention in the economy, preaches unlimited freedom of action for business, and advocates the free interplay of the forces which stem from capitalism. However, this causes it to get caught up in insoluble contradiction. It is extremely difficult to put into practice a unitary politics of the bourgeois class, so long as there is complete freedom among economic organizations to develop in whatever way they choose, and so long as individual groups of capitalists are completely free to compete among themselves. The conclusions we draw from this is that fascism is destined to fail due to the economic anarchy of capitalism, despite holding the reins of government firmly in its grasp, despite commanding the powerful weapon of the state apparatus, and despite the fact that it has an organization extending through the entire peninsula, which mobilizes the middle classes, and to a certain extent the proletariat as well, in the interests of the united bourgeoisie. The mighty fascist apparatus may give the impression that fascist power will last, but at its very roots, this power suffers from a fundamental contradiction because fascism hasn't shown that it possesses a new way of overcoming the capitalist crisis. It will show a new way, and that is engaging in imperialism and war, um, and and doubling down on all the things that it's already doing with the patriotism and whatnot. Today, same as before, we believe that the capitalist crisis will not be overcome by, quote, heroic means. I've repeated here that fundamental concepts for the analysis of fascism which I expounded in my first report. The conclusions we have drawn are the same as before and they are fully confirmed by almost 2 years of fascist dictatorship. I actually want to take this. We're going to put that in there, but I'm not going to summarize it now. It's a bit about fascist trade unions. Continuing. Let's return to the historical phase we are told in the time of the Fourth Congress when the fascists took power. The conclusion of the general offensive against the revolutionary forces and against the old detainers of power in Italy, the March on Rome. In that report, I hadn't yet touched on the controversial question that arose in our ranks during the Fourth Congress, though Comrade Zinoviev mentioned it in his speech. What happened during our absence from Italy? A coup or a comedy? I will briefly take up this issue, although, in my opinion, there are three options: coup, comedy, or revolution. Let's remind ourselves of the characteristic features of the fascist seizure of power. There is no armed struggle. There is merely a mobilization of fascism which threatened a revolutionary conquest of power, and sort of defensive mobilization of the state, which at a certain point actually declared a state of emergency. But the state didn't put up any real resistance. There was no armed struggle. Instead, fighting, a compromise was reached, and at a certain moment the struggle was, so to speak, put on hold, postponed. This is not because the king, at the right moment, refused to sign the decree of martial law, but because the compromise had been evidently been prepared for a long time before. The fascist government therefore established itself in a normal way. After the resignation of the Facta government, the king summoned Mussolini to form a new cabinet. The leader of the self-styled revolution reached Rome from Milan in a sleeping car. It was at every stop along the way he was cheered by official representatives of the state. Why one cannot talk of a revolution is not merely because power was taken without insurrectional attack, but because all the other reasons we touched on earlier when considering the historical significance of fascism. From a social point of view, fascism does not represent a major change. It does not represent the historical negation of the old bourgeois methods of government. It merely represents the completely logical and dialectical continuation of the preceding stage of so called democratic and liberal bourgeois government. We resolutely oppose the statement, repeated over and over again by the fascists, that their assumption of power can be equated with revolution. In his speeches, Mussolini says, quote, "We made a revolution." But when we retort, quote, "There was no revolution, no struggle, no revolutionary terror, because an out and out seizure of power never took place, and there is no real annihilation of the enemy." Then Mussolini answers with an argument which, from a historical point of view, is quite laughable. Quote, "We still have time for that," he says. "We will complete our revolution in due course." End quote. But a revolution cannot be put on ice. Not even the most daring and powerful of leaders has that kind of power. Such arguments aren't enough to refute the critique which points out that the revolution took place. You cannot say, quote, "It's true, but these events haven't yet happened, but can be remedied whenever we want," end quote. It is, of course, always possible that new battles will take place. But the March of Rome was certainly no battle, not a revolution. It also said, quote, "There has nevertheless been an unusual kind of change of governmental power, a coup," end quote. But I won't dwell on this point because in the end it just boils down to play on words. Also, when we use the term coup d'etat, we understand that it not to mean merely a change of government personnel, a mere change in the general staff and the party power, but rather an action that eliminates, in a violent way, the underlying orientation of every government that ruled up to that time. Fascism didn't do that. Fascism talks a lot about how it was against parliamentarism and about how anti-democratic and anti-parliamentarian it is. But taken as a whole, its social program is the same old program of democratic lies, just an ideological weapon for conservation of bourgeois rule. Even before fascism took power, it very rapidly became parliamentarian. Indeed, it ruled for a year and a half without dispersing the old lower house, which is composed of majority non fascists and even of anti fascists. Displaying the flexibility so characteristic of bourgeois politicians, this house then hastened to put itself at Mussolini's disposal, or to legalize his position and to grant him as many votes of confidence as he deigned to ask of them. Even the first Mussolini cabinet, as he frequently recalls in his quote, left-wing speeches, was not built on purely fascist foundations. It included representatives of the most significant of the remaining bourgeois parties, ranging from Giolidi's party and the Popolari to the Democratic left. It was therefore a coalition government. Here, then, is what the so-called coup has begotten. A party with only 35 MPs in the House took power and occupied the overwhelming majority of ministerial and vice ministerial posts. In other words, it was a completely illegal seizure of power, and the bourgeois state helped it all the way, and it never made any substantial changes. It's just more overt about its attacks. And whenever people complain about it, they blame the fascists, but actually they blame the socialists. Anyway, there's another important historical event which occurred in Italy, which has nothing to do with the March on Rome, and which also needs to be highlighted. I refer to the occupation of Italy as a whole by the fascists, an occupation then trained by previous events and whose geographical spread can be clearly plotted. The seizure of power by Mussolini was merely the acknowledgement of a previously existing relationship of forces. Every government raised to power, above all facta, has given fascism free rein. It was the latter which really governed the country. It was given a completely free hand and had to take the state apparatus at its disposal. The Facta cabinet was in charge for 2 months, awaiting the moment when fascism would deem it proper to take power. These are the reasons why we use the term comedy. At any rate, we completely stand by our statement that this was not a revolution. What has happened is rather a change in the bourgeois leadership, a change, moreover, that was prepared for in advance and gradually accomplished. In the economic and social field, it does not represent, not even in the realm of domestic policy, any kind of transformation of the program of Italian bourgeoisie. As a matter of fact, the great shockwave of the so called fascist revolution, both before and after the March on Rome, does not rest on the official utilization of the state apparatus, but rather on illegal reaction flanked by the tacit support of the police, local administration, bureaucracy, and the army. Tacit support, and we need to be emphatic about this, which was already there in abundance even before the fascists took power. In Mussolini's, because, any the police actually would like arm these guys and give them weapons. Black Shirts and Reds goes over this in depth, but you know the fascists were the jackboots of the police, and they would just do things that the police wouldn't normally. Um, it wouldn't be legal for them to do in their position, right? Like how it's technically illegal for police to do an unlawful search and seizure, but for a bunch of private citizens with guns and uh, consider people around them their lessers for one degree, for one reason or another. They just do it, and then the police are like, oh well, slap on the wrist. Go ahead, Kami Game. But I will continue reading in the meantime while you type, unless you want to say something. Okay. Um, okay, go ahead. Yes. No, that's not what's being said here. What's being said here is all the structures remained. Um, it, it's still a dictatorship, right? It's just that all the structures remained intact. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Unsurprising. Yep. 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 First says tragedy, then is farce. Anyway, thanks for that input there. Uh, in Mussolini's first speeches to House, he said, "quote I could throw you out of this room with the support of my troops. I could do it, but I'm not going to. The House can continue to perform its duties, provided it is ready to collaborate with me." End quote. The overwhelming majority of the old House was quite willing to bow to the orders of the new chief. As a matter of fact, no new legislation was introduced after the fascists took power. In the realm of domestic policy, no emergency laws were enacted. Certainly, there have been political persecutions, which we will discuss later, but officially the laws have not been modified. There have been no exceptional decrees like those approved by bourgeois governments during revolutionary phases, such as, for example, the ones enacted by Crispy and Pelot, who periodically sought protection against the revolutionary parties and their leaders by adopting a policy consisting of states of emergency, military jurisdiction, and repressive measures. Fascism, on the other hand, continues to use the same original and modern techniques against the proletarian forces it used before taking power. They have even declared that they will disband their illegal assault troops as soon as the other parties have done the same. In reality, the fascist fighting corps have now disappeared as organizations external to the state, only to then be inserted into the state apparatus through the formation of the national militia. And now, as before, this armed force remains at the disposal of the fascist party and of Mussolini in person. This represents a new organization, officially absorbed within the state apparatus. It is pillar on which fascism rests. On the agenda, the question remains, should we allow this organization to disappear or not? Can fascism be required to rely on constitutional means in domestic politics rather than on these new organs? Of course, fascism hasn't so far acknowledged the old norms of constitutional law, and at present the militia is harshest enemy of all those who aspire to bring down fascist rule. Legally speaking, there are no emergency laws in our country. When in February 1923 thousands of Italian communists were arrested, we expected fascism to start a legal campaign against us, to take drastic steps and obtain the harshest sentences. But the situation developed in a very favorable way, and we are judged according to old democratic laws. The Italian Penal Code, the work of representative in the extreme bourgeois left, Minister Zanardelli, is extremely liberal and leaves much room for interpretation. With regard to crimes to do with politics and beliefs, is particularly mild and flexible. It was therefore easy of us to assume the following position. Quote, Fascism, getting rid of its enemies and taking dictatorial measures against us is quite understandable. It is perfectly right to judge us and find us guilty because we are communists, and because we aim to overthrow the existing government by revolutionary means. However, from a legal point of view, what we do is not prohibited. Other things certainly are prohibited, but you have absolutely no evidence of the alleged conspiracy, of the criminal association on which the charge is based. End quote. Not only did we stick to this line, but thanks to it, we were acquitted by the tribunals because it was absolutely possible to convict us on the basis of the existing laws. Absolutely impossible. We could therefore see that the judiciary and police apparatus, from the fascism's point of view, were not up to the task. Fascism had got hold of the state apparatus but was unable to transform it to suit its purposes. It did not know how to get rid of the communist leaders through court rulings. It had its cadres, its own terrorist organizations, but within the justice system, it did not deem it necessary to employ new weapons. This is, for me, a further demonstration of the total inadequacy of bourgeois liberal guarantees and of liberal justice in the struggle against the freedom of movement of the proletariat. It is true that in such circumstances, our defense had to adopt legal means as well. But if the enemy possesses an illegal organization, by means of which it can resolve the issue in a quite different way, these democratic guarantees lose any meaning. Fascism sticks to the old policy of left democratic lies, of equality before the law for all, and so on and so forth. This does not stop it from continuing to seriously persecute the proletariat. I merely wish to say, and I assume what he means, and that is the old anarchist quote, the law in its majestic equality forbids both rich man and poor from stealing bread. Continuing. These are supposed, they mean, oh, I'm sorry. There we go. I merely wish to say, with reference to the purely political trials by which the leaders of the revolutionary proletariat were supposed to be crushed, the new situation created by fascism hasn't changed the classical system of the democratic bourgeois governments at all. A revolution, on the other hand, is always characterized by the transformation of the political laws. I'll now briefly deal with events that occurred after fascism took power. First of all, a few words of the economic situation in Italy. Fascists are continually telling us that the economic crisis of 1920 and 21 was followed, after they took power by a period of economic growth. They maintain that in the past 2 years the situation has stabilized, economic equilibrium has returned, order has been reestablished, and the whole situation undergone a marked improvement. They are supposed to be the advantages of fascism for all social classes, the blessing for which the Italian people is indebted to fascism. This official position is supported by full-scale mobilization of the whole of the press, and by the employment of all means of a party firmly entrenched in power has at its disposal. But this is just an official lie. The current economic situation in Italy is bad. The rate of exchange of the lira has plummeted to the lowest level since the end of the war. Is worth just 4.3 US cents. For example, fluctuations in the exchange rate have seen it drop to the lowest value so far recorded. Fascism hasn't been able to improve the situation. It is true that, according to Mussolini, without him the lira's rate of exchange would have dropped even lower, but this argument cannot be taken seriously. The fascists have also claimed to have reestablished a balanced budget. This is not true from the material point of view. After all, it is well known that with the state budgets you can demonstrate whatever you want. In any case, fascists did not contradict the statement made by the opposition's experts, according to whom, if the price of coal had not dropped compared to the 1920 to 21 prices, and if war costs, which have to be discharged over a given period of time, had not been recorded in a different way, the budget deficit would be far higher today than in 1920 to 21, as can be proven by the figures alone. The index of the economic situation certainly shows widespread decline. As regards the unemployment figures, they were very high in 1920, particularly in 1921. And it's true that they are lower now, but the data over the last few months shows that unemployment is rising again, and that the industrial crisis has not been overcome once and for all. In the business world, the situation is extremely tense. Trade is encountering major difficulties. This is proven by statistics on bankruptcies, which show an enormous increase compared with recent years. Also, the cost of living index in large cities is rising. It is quite clear that the whole economic situation in Italy is getting worse. It hasn't stabilized at all. And what fascism has produced by means of enormous pressure exerted by a bourgeoisie is only an external stability. The official indices show that all that has been attained is just an expression of this terrible pressure exerted on the proletariat. That all has been accomplished has been at the expense of the proletarian class and solely the interests of the ruling class. Nor should be forgotten that the very existence of this pitiless pressure makes it more likely that there will be an eruption of those very classes that were sacrificed in the fascist attempt to stabilize the economic situation in the exclusive interest of the big bourgeoisie. I will now move on to the fascist government's attitude towards the workers. I pointed out earlier that the great political trials staged against us have provided evidence of the inadequacy of the fascist state's legal apparatus. Nevertheless, whenever they have been able to accuse comrades of committing common law offenses rather than the law considers, quote, political, they have come down very heavily indeed. Numerous clashes have occurred and are still taking place between fascists and proletarians, mainly communists. In such skirmishes, there are generally casualties on both sides. It is a notorious fact that, long after the fascists took power, fascists who have killed workers and were still being granted complete immunity, even when the proof against them was conclusive. Workers, on the other hand, who wounded or killed fascists in self-defense, received extremely severe sentences. The amnesty which has been decreed is only to the advantage of those who have committed common law offenses for national ends. In other words, is an amnesty for fascist assassins, while those common criminals who pursue anti-national ends, for example, who fight against fascism, must expect the harshest punishments, is an unalloyed class amnesty. A later amnesty would reduce sentences to between 2 and 3 years, but it's important to note that our comrades are generally sentenced to 10, 15, or even 20 years of imprisonment. Hundreds and hundreds of workers, Italian comrades, are today in jail because they didn't manage to get over the border quickly enough after armed confrontations with the fascists. Confrontations they participated in, but were almost inevitably provoked by fascists. Thus, the present Italian government is carrying out the most ferocious oppression against the working class. Whenever the working class tries to defend itself against the fascist terror, legal action immediately follows in a way that does not differ much from the old political trials for, quote, treason. In strictly legal terms, the right of the Communist Party, anarchist movement, etc., to exist continues to be guaranteed by law as before. What isn't possible, in theory, and it's pretty much the same as far as the press is concerned. Officially, there is still freedom of the press. all parties are allowed to publish their organs, but although there's no legal pretext for it, the police authorities can prohibit the distribution of a newspaper. Up to now, only communists have been the target of this prohibition. Our daily paper, Il Lavatore of Trieste, has been prohibited in accordance with an Austrian law still in force in the town. That's the old Austrian laws are used against the revolutionaries, that is, against those who, during the war, due to their defeatism, were called accomplices of Austria. To this, we can add the suppression of newspaper by armed bands, the raids on editorial offices by which a publication of proletarian press is made impossible, the sabotage of journalists' associations, and so on and so forth. Even now, our newspaper, as well as those from the opposition, are still often destroyed or burned when they reach their destination. The fascist government exerts a terrible pressure on the trade unions. Workers are forced to join the fascist unions. The red trade union offices have been destroyed. But despite this, they haven't managed to rally the masses in the fascist economical organizations. The figures published by the fascists are a bluff. In fact, the proletariat is to stay unorganized from a trade union point of view. At times, the masses go along with the movements led by fascist unions, but only because it offers them their only opportunity to strike. Many workers, many categories, which in their overwhelming majority are non-favor of the fascist unions, and which in the elections for the internal commissions vote in their overwhelming majority against fascists and for the revolutionary candidates, have to join the fascist trade unions just so that they can try to fight the bourgeoisie. Thus, a grave conflict ensues within the fascist trade union movement. It can't avoid strikes and is drawn into a struggle against fascist organization of bosses. This conflict within the fascist and governmental organs is always resolved to the detriment of the workers. Hence the discontent, the grave crisis that the leaders of the fascist union movement have been unable to conceal at their recent meetings. Their attempts at reorganizing the industrial proletariat have completely failed. Their action aims to create a pretext, a superfluous pretext, for putting a break in the activity of free unions and keeping the proletariat in a state of disorganization. Recently, the government has taken steps against the free trade unions as well. Official state control of the internal organizational and administrative work of unions has been introduced. This is a very serious step, but it does not change the essence of the situation, as the work of the free unions had already been almost completely paralyzed by earlier measures. Free unions continue to exist, as do the chambers of labor, Camere del Lavoro, the trade guilds, etc. But it's absolutely impossible to provide accurate figures regarding their membership, even when they have managed to remain in contact with the masses. This is because orderly and continuous collection for contributions and recruitment drives are almost completely forbidden. Up to now, it hasn't been possible in Italy to reconstruct the cadres of the trade union organizations. But the great advantage of fascism is supposedly that there will be no more strikes. This, for the bourgeoisie and the Philistines of the pay bourgeoisie, is a real clincher. Back in 1920, when there was no fascism, they say, masses of workers could be seen taking to the streets every day. Here a strike, there a procession, open confrontations breaking out. Nowadays, there are no longer any strikes. There is no longer any unrest. In the factories, the work is no longer interrupted, and peace and order reign. This is the employer's point of view. Nevertheless, strikes are still called, and during these strikes, incidents worthy of mention have occurred arising out of relations existing between fascist trade unions, revolutionary workers, government, and employers. The situation is definitionally unstable. The continued presence of class struggle is demonstrated by a number of significant events. Indeed, there is no doubt, despite the obstacles that is on the rise. The action of the fascist government is also directed against workers in the state-owned enterprises. For example, out-and-out terror is being used against the railway workers. A great number of them have been sacked. Of course, the first ones to have gotten rid of been active members of the revolutionary organizations. The railway workers' organizations used to be one of the trade unions whose leadership was much further to the left. The government acted in the same way towards several other state-linked enterprises. The fascists riposted. But we have given proletarians the 8-hour day. The 8-hour day is now established by law. These are great conquests. Name another bourgeois government of a major country which has promulgated such a law. But this law contains rider clauses which totally annul the principle of the 8-hour working day. In fact, even if the law were rigorously enforced, it would be possible to introduce an average working day which was a lot longer than 8 hours. In any case, the law is not enforced. With the approval of fascist trade unions, the employers do whatever they want within the workplace. And finally, the proletariat in Italy have already conquered the 8-hour working day with its own organizations in any case. Indeed, several federations had obtained a working day that was even shorter. We aren't, therefore, talking about a quote gift bestowed on by fascism on the Italian proletariat. In fact, we could say that unemployment is increasing because the bosses are forcing the workers in the factories to work a lot more than 8 hours a day. The other, quote, conquests are not even worthy of mention. Workers who had previously secured certain rights, a certain freedom of movement and action in the factories, are now subjected to an iron discipline. The Italian workers work today under the knout. Let's say knout. Ah, a whip. Gotcha. As regards the economic situation, all available figures show that wages have dropped dramatically after having temporarily reached a level corresponding to a rise in prices of indispensable goods, the prices of which today are 4 to 5 times higher than before the war. The workers' standard of living has worsened. Certainly, quote, order has been reestablished in the workplace, but it's a reactionary order, in order of the general interest of exploitation by the bosses. There is plenty of tangible proof that all fascist union action, including that of their trade unions, is in the service of the employers and the union of industrialists. As regards the dockers' organizations, despite being led by notorious opportunists of the likes of Giulietti, or maybe precisely because of this, it managed up to a certain point to resist the fascist power and survive the march on Rome. Existing alongside this organization, there was a dockers cooperative called the Garibaldi. Just as this new contract was about to be signed between the government and the ship owners, the Garibaldi thought it would make a more competitive offer. This would have meant dangerous competition for the ship owners. It would have forced them to make more attractive but less profitable offer. So what did they do? The group representing the shipping magnates, the maritime kings, issued an order to the fascist government, and the fascist government hastened to carry it out. Using the pretext of a conflict provoked by the local authorities, police officers were sent to occupy the offices of the cooperative and force it to suspend its activities. The situation is very complicated, but we can sum it up as follows. It is clear that the fascist state apparatus is in the service of the capitalist groups fighting against the working class. Today, the whole life of the proletariat, the whole industrial life of Italy, provides the most damning proof, the clearest demonstration that the development of government into a steering organ and business committee of capitalists has been realized in its most extreme form in our country. We should also be aware that the similar phenomena are affecting the farm laborers. I cite as an example the strike led by the fascist trade union, which was fought by the so-called, quote, rice weeders in the field of La Melina. Launched with the approval of the fascist union, it was a strike which would eventually see the full might of reactionary terror hurled against it. The strikers, women all, were attacked by the police and militia, that is, by the organs of the fascist government, and the strike was stifled in blood. There are hundreds of similar examples giving a picture of the situation in which the Italian proletariat finds itself today. The fascist trade union policy allows workers to try and conduct struggles, but as soon as there's any actual conflict between workers and bosses, the government intervenes with brutal violence in the interests of capitalist exploitation. What is the relationship between fascism and the middle classes? A whole series of events gives damning proof to the disappointment of the middle classes. At first, they saw fascism as their movement, as the start of a new historical period. They believed that the rule of the big bourgeoisie and its political leaders had been brought to an end, and without the need for any proletarian dictatorship, without the Bolshevik Revolution, which had caused them to tremble in 1919 and 20, they believed that the rule of the middle classes, of the ex-servicemen, of those who had fought in victorious war, was about to be realized. They thought that they could create a powerful organization which would enable them to take up the reins of the state. In order to defend their own interests, they would want to develop an autonomous policy which would fight against both capitalist and proletarian dictatorships. The bankruptcy of this program is shown by the measures adopted by the fascist government, measures which not only hit the proletariat extremely hard, but also the middle classes who were raving about having created their own power, their own dictatorship, and who had been drawn into demonstrations against the old apparatus of bourgeois rule, even which they thought to have brought down with the fascist revolution. All fascism's governmental measures show that it's in the service of the big bourgeoisie, of industrial, financial, and commercial capital, and that its power is directed against the interests of every other class, not just the proletariat, but the middle classes as well. For instance, measures introduced in the housing field have hit all classes indiscriminately. During the war, a moratorium was introduced which imposed certain limitations on the rent increases landlords can propose. The fascists have abolished these, giving landlords the option of raising rents. True, after having reestablished unlimited freedom in this field, they had to enact a new law which limited the rights of landlords. But this new law is of a purely demagogic nature. Its only purpose is to placate the anger for the first laws aroused. Yet there remains a huge shortage of lodgings. The same applies to the educational reform. This was defined by Mussolini as, quote, the most fascist of all reforms, end quote. It was drafted by the famous philosopher Gentile. From a technical point of view, it is a reform which has to be taken seriously. To resolve the issue according to new criteria, truly remarkable work has been done. But the whole tendency of the reform is aristocratic. A good education for the sons of workers, the poor, the petty bourgeois, is rendered impossible. It means that only the well-to-do, that is, those families which can afford the high school fees for their children, will enjoy the privilege of culture. And that's why this reform has been badly received by the middle class and petty bourgeois, and even by teachers and professors whose economic condition has further deteriorated, and who are now subjected to its stricter discipline. Another example, to solve the problem of bureaucratic reform, fascism has carried out a review of the salaries of state white-collar workers according to a principle: decrease of the lowest salaries, increase of the salaries of senior functionaries. This reform has provoked a feeling of discontent towards the fascist government amongst the junior ranks of the state bureaucracy as well. There is also the question of taxes, which I won't deal with in depth here, but which clearly shows the class character of the fascist government. Basically, the latter wanted to rebalance the budget. However, it won't take any measures against capitalists in pursuit of this aim. In order to raise more revenue, it simply increased the budget burden weighing down on the proletariat, on consumers, and on the middle and petty bourgeoisie. One of the main reasons for discontent towards fascism resides in the treatment of the rural population, small tenants, etc. Fascism is the enemy of the industrial proletariat, but has caused no less marked worsening conditions of the peasant class. Previous governments have already taken measures to regulate land taxation, but they were never applied. The fascist minister de Stefani was now tied to enforce them in such a draconian way that an unbearable fiscal burden now weighs heavily on the whole of the small landed property, even affecting the incomes of small farmers, tenants, and farmhands. This is aggravated by municipal and provincial taxes, which local socialist administrations in the past have managed to maneuver in an anti-capitalist direction which was favorable to the workers. Nowadays, taxes on cattle and other taxes are instead causing a severe decline in the condition of small farmers. Recently, the tax on wine is slightly reduced, a reduction which aimed to blunt the sharpness of discontent in the countryside. But all these taxes represent, now as before, a terrible burden for the rural population. I will just give the example of a comrade for the Italian delegation who is himself a small farmer. For his 12-hectare plot, which he owns part rents, he must pay 1,500 euros, that's 12.5% of an output of 12,000 euros. Just imagine how intensely he has to farm that plot to ensure the existence of his family employees. A noteworthy phenomenon has taken place in the south of Italy. Last year, the harvest of grapes was excellent. Prices fell dramatically, and this year wine is only fetching very low prices. In the South, there are many tenant farmers who say they're not making any money, but they grow crops as well as the grape, and they generally use the other crop to somehow cover production costs, whilst growing provides the income on which they live. But given the current wine prices, taxes, and wine production costs, etc., there is nothing left over for them. Production costs and retail prices are the same. The peasant farmer doesn't have enough to provide for his family. He is then forced again to debt, to ask for advances from pay bourgeois of the rural centers or from the large landlords. In this latter case, he has to mortgage his land. In the immediate post-war period, raising rents is forbidden by law. This law was abolished by fascists. Small tenants now have to pay rent to landlords, which has gone up from anything from 100 to 400%. Even the clauses concerning the division of the crop between tenant and landlord have been drastically modified to the advantage of the latter. In order to survive, the small landowner is forced to sell part of his land, to give up the plot for which he paid half cash, half loan. If one day he can't pay, he immediately loses both the acquired land and the money already paid out. What is presently taking place is an out and out expropriation of small farmers. Those who paid high prices for their land in the post war period are now without cash, are being forced to sell for less than they paid. I repeat, this is a real expropriation of small landing owning farmers by large landowners, a phenomenon that tends to become increasingly widespread. Every measure the fascist government has taken in this sphere has but one consequence: the worsening of the condition of the rural proletariat. Formally, Formerly, the socialists conducted an agitation whose methods we couldn't entirely endorse. They tried to get the government to undertake major land reclamation works to occupy the farm workers, to fight unemployment, and thus improve the labor's bargaining position in the countryside. The fascist government has now suspended these works in order to balance the budget. A huge number of rural workers have consequently been thrown onto the labor market. Poverty in the countryside has increased, and the proletariat standard of living has further declined. Discontent has been directed at the government. The fascists have talked at length about the parasitism of the old red cooperatives, which by means of parliamentary pressure in favor of public works used to systematically exploit the state. That's hilarious. But now they are doing the exact same thing. They're trying with their fascist cooperatives, almost the entire cooperative apparatus of the socialists have been forcibly transferred to them, to carry out a similar policy in the interests of the new fascist bureaucracy. The dire conditions which has been foisted on the peasantry by fascism means this class now sees the fascist government as a power which is hostile to its interests and is gradually taking up a more combative stance. There have already been instances of armed peasant revolts against taxes and against the fascist municipal administrations, which have resulted in bloody clashes. The fact that this is happening is extremely important and it characterizes the situation very well. Having commented on fascism's social policy, I'll now move to consider its policy in other fields, starting with religion. The stance fascism takes on this issue is an example of its theoretical flexibility. To begin with, in order to exploit certain attitudes traditionally held by the middle classes and by intellectuals, fascism adopted an anti-clerical program. Thus, it did fight the Catholic Popular Party in order to undermine its influence in the countryside. In a second period, fascism started competing with the Popolari and became the official party of religion and of Catholicism. Both from an historical and theoretical point of view, this is quite remarkable. The Vatican is conducting a pro-fascist policy. It has been very happy with the concessions the fascist government has made by agreeing to improving conditions for the clergy and restoring the teaching of religion in schools. Mussolini, when he was in Switzerland, was the editor of a paid collection of anti-religious books, tuppenny halfpenny pamphlets, in which the non-existence of God was demonstrated, and you could read about papal misdeeds, the story of the woman elected to a papal throne, and all the other rubbish which for centuries has clouded the minds of workers. This same Mussolini nowadays, wherever he deems it useful, invokes the Lord, proclaims he is governing in God's name. The political opportunism of the Vatican hides a fundamental antagonism which is brought out in the clash between fascists and the populari, the latter representing a kind of Christian democracy. The Catholic idea, as such, is opposed to fascism because fascism represents an exaltation of the fatherland, of the nation, and its deification. From a Catholic point of view, this is a heresy. Fascism would like to make of Catholicism an Italian national question, but the Catholic Church's policy is inherently international and universal because it seeks to extend its political and moral influence across all borders. This is extremely significant conflict which has been resolved for the time being thanks to compromise. Let's now look briefly at fascist foreign policy. The fascists, as far as international politics is concerned, claims to have found Italy in an extremely dire situation. The country was a laughingstock, but after fascism took power and Italy acquired a strong government, it started to be treated very differently, and its position on the international stage has now very much changed. Events has nevertheless shown that all fascist foreign policy can do is continue the old tradition of the Italian bourgeoisie. Indeed, nothing has changed, nothing new has occurred. After playing his main cards in the Corfu incident, uh, Mussolini immediately renounced coups of this sort, saw reason, and was welcomed into the ranks of orthodox diplomacy, taking great care not to repeat the earlier mistake elsewhere. The great French and English newspapers write that Mussolini is a very astute politician, and that follows the Corfu expedition, which was rather a childish action. He has become very wise and prudent. What's this Corfu incident? Greece and Italy. Okay, so they bombarded and sought to occupy this city or region, one of the two. Where's dispute between Albanian Greek? Okay, interesting. Continuing. As a matter of fact, Mussolini's international policy is the only option Italy has, a second rate policy, because in the struggle between the great world powers, Italy plays a subordinate role. In the matter of war reparations and in the Franco German conflict, Mussolini has always taken an intermediate stance, which has exerted absolutely no influence, one way or the other, on the existing power relations. Its erratic attitude has been welcomed with satisfaction, one minute by Germany, then by France, then by Great Britain. It is true that fascism was able to modify, or rather overturn, power relations within the Italian border, but wasn't able to pull off the same stunt again on an international scale because absolutely no influence on interstate relations. Since the necessary historical and social presuppositions for such influence are lacking, one cannot really talk seriously of an Italian imperialism. That's going to change in Africa in particular. A few facts will place the extremely modest foreign policy which Mussolini is constrained to follow in the correct light. The Fiume question was resolved by means of a compromise with Yugoslavia. Threats of war against Yugoslavia have given way to a policy of compromise and reconciliation with this country. Here, too, imperialist nationalism has a bow before the real facts of foreign politics. The recognition of Soviet Russia also shows that, although it is quite possible to conduct an extreme right wing policy in Italy, the fact of the fascists taking power is not sufficient to extend such a policy onto the international level. What effect did the recognition of Soviet Russia have on the Italian proletariat? The Italian proletariat has a fairly good revolutionary education and didn't swallow the bait dangled by the fascist press. A press that until the day before had recorded every anti-Bolshevik slander, every fairy tale about Russia, and then all of a sudden, on command, had started to write exactly the opposite. That is, that the Communist Revolution is no more, that Bolshevism is liquidated, and that Russia is a bourgeois country like any other, that Italy and Russia share common interests, that Russia and Italy can collaborate, etc. A gross blunder was also made when they said, "We stand between two revolutions, two dictatorships, two examples of the same political method of eliminating democracy, which by their very nature must arrive at parallel action, and so on and so forth. This is an explanation that can only cause hilarity. In reality, what we are talking about here is unadorned capitalist interest. Having been unable to prevent industrial decline due to an unfavorable balance of trade, Italian capitalists became interested in establishing relations with Russia in a search for new markets for commodities. The Italian proletariat has judged this event as proof of fascism's weakness, not Soviet Russia's. I must nevertheless remark that the correct political interpretation of this international event of primary importance for the Italian proletariat has been clouded by an unpleasant incident. Some Russian comrades issued statements which, in explaining this political event, went rather too far, containing as they did declarations of friendship towards Italy that could be interpreted as declarations of friendship towards official Italy, towards Grand Duce. I think the giant shit Mussolini. This was bound to provoke a certain degree of uneasiness amongst the proletariat, which is being persecuted and hunted down by the fascists. If this false step had been avoided, everything would have met the full comprehension of the Italian revolutionary proletariat. We come now to the relations which exist between the fascist party apparatus and the state apparatus under a new government. These relations have raised quite thorny problems, the effect of which has been severe crises and continuous conflict within the ranks of fascism. From the very start, the internal life of the fascist organizations has been extremely turbulent, but with 700,000 members is a very large organization, and conflicts are inevitable in an organization of that size. Nevertheless, the harshness and violence of the internal conflicts within the fascist movement in Italy are exceptional. At the start, the problems of the relations between the party and the state was resolved in an imperfect way by placing political commissioners drawn from the ranks of the party alongside the state authorities. These exerted a certain influence over state officials and therefore had de facto power in their hands. The inevitable outcome, of course, was friction. This method of organization was then reviewed, and the old rights of the state apparatus had to be restored, eliminating the fascist commissaries. But the crisis, which was overcome only with the greatest of difficulties, has not been resolved in a definitive way, because within the fascist movements, two currents have formed. The first of them, which aims at a revision of extremist fascism, wants to return to legality and declares, "Power's in our hands. We have our great leader Mussolini. We can restrict ourselves to governing through the normal and legal exercises of power. The whole state apparatus is at our disposal. We can form the government. Our deuce." Doesn't deuce mean shit? Okay, I see. It's a title. Where is it? Gotcha. Okay, okay. It's trusted by all parties. Therefore, the party does not need to get caught up in administrative matters anymore. This current would like to renounce violent struggle and the use of legal methods and get back to normal relations. It tries to influence Mussolini by isolating him from the more extreme fascist elements. These extreme fascist elements are recruited among the local hierarchs, and they are designed by the Abyssinian term Ras. Rassism is for local dictatorships of fascist occupation troops throughout Italy, and indeed it advocates a quote second wave of terror against its opponents. Granassi, who recently proposed a death penalty for anti-fascists, is one of its typical representatives. Between these two extremes, between the tendency which advocates a second wave offensive against the opposition, and which says, if Mussolini says that the revolution is not yet accomplished, then we must complete it, then we must immediately order, their words, quote, 5 minutes of shooting to annihilate all the enemies of fascism once and for all, end quote. Between this tendency and the one which would prefer better relations between fascism and certain opposition elements, and even with reformers such as leaders of the Confederation General de Livorno, Mussolini has up to now maintained a certain equilibrium by making shrewd concessions now to one side, now to the other. He has restored the old rights of the state apparatus officials, but has no intention of renouncing the key support provided by the organizations operating independently from the state apparatus, since it is these organizations which sustain the fascist power, and which allow it to defend itself against revolutionary attacks. Fascism hasn't dissolved parliament. The old parliament, as I pointed out earlier, was constantly passing votes of confidence in Mussolini and conceding him full powers, which granted him everything he asked for. Nevertheless, fascism wanted to modify the electoral law. In Italy, the system in place was proportional representation. Fascism wanted to be certain of retaining the majority. I believe this would have still been possible using the machinery of the old electoral system. Even under proportional representation with polls, fascism would have maintained what it has now. On the basis of the new electoral law, the party lists which wins the majority of the votes, contains at least 25% of all votes cast, has a right to 2/3 of the seat in the new parliament. This means that a quarter of the overall vote is enough to occupy 2/3 of the seats, on condition, of course, that another party list doesn't gain 26 or 27% of the entire vote, in which case the latter list would be awarded the majority. In the majority party's national lists, there were 375 names. So in actual fact, these deputies have been elected by Mussolini himself, since the fact that this list would obtain more than 25% of the vote was in no doubt. A real battle about who would be nominated has broken out inside the fascist party. Around 10,000 fascist races had set their sights on being among the 375 elected. It wasn't even possible to reserve all the posts on the list for fascist candidates. In the elections, a dual tactic was employed. In the north, where fascist organization is very strong, there was no need for compromise, and electoral lists composed exclusively of fascists were put forward. In the south, where fascist organization is much weaker, they had to compromise, and politicians of the old regime were allowed plenty of slots on the national list. Thus, all the candidates would be new men from the ranks of the fascist party, and some would be, for want of a better word, traditional politicians. The elections have now taken place, and we won't talk about them in detail. We know that the fascist terror hasn't yet reached a stage where it is absolutely impossible for the opposition to exercise their vote. The fascist government maneuvered with a certain dexterity. I know that by totally removing the opposition vote, the elections will have immediately lost all political significance. The government therefore restricted itself to influencing the outcome. Mussolini could now say, quote, "The elections are now over. The vast majority has voted for us. This consensus of the vast majority of Italian people legitimizes our power. One can no longer speak of the rule of a minority." End quote. In order to assess the conduct and outcome of the elections, it is necessary to clearly distinguish between the north and south of Italy. In the north, the fascist organizations are very powerful, mainly in the country but also in the industrial towns. Thus, up there, it can keep an eye on its electorate and check that the party members vote the way they're supposed to. In other words, it can almost totally suppress the secret ballot. Certainly, the fascists have fought ruthlessly against their adversaries, but because they were counting on their own strength, they had to let them exercise their right to vote. Therefore, in the North, fascism only obtained a very small majority. That is, a majority in the true sense of more than 50% rather than the artificial majority of over 25% which they introduced. In some cities like Milan, it is well known that the fascist national list was in a minority compared to the opposition lists. In the South, on the other hand, fascism lists of candidates collected an overwhelming majority of the votes. The overall number of votes cast in Italy as a whole was 7.3 million, and the fascists obtained 4.7 million of them. 3.65 million is half the votes cast. The fascists polled over a million more than that. That is the strangest aspect of the thing. In the South, apart from the few districts where agrarian conflicts similar to ones in the Po Valley have taken place, a dyed-in-the-wool fascism has never really existed. Fascism gained a foothold there in the following manner. After the fascists took power, the local bourgeois cliques thought well to adhere to fascism. In a formal sense, it retained their foothold over the local administrative machinery and continued to be able to exploit it. In the South, a significant level of fascist organization doesn't really exist, and yet is actually in the South, by employing these very simple means that fascism has obtained an overwhelming majority referred to above. Here, the elections have been conducted at will. Representatives on the rival lists have been chased off, the fascist squads having been organized, granted electoral certificates, and put at the disposal of the local administration, with every member of these squads voting 30, 40, or even 50 times. Given this situation, Mussolini has been forced to make the extraordinary admission that it was the south of Italy which saved the country, that the most seasoned forces in the battle against revolutionary democracy were to be found in the south. That in 1919 and 20, it was the South which had allowed itself to be led astray. Thus, its previous political interpretation of the Italian situation that the North was the most progressive and civilized part of the country has been turned on its head. In recent speeches, true, he has gone back from his previous theory and seems to have given up trying to make his pronouncements agree with the official statistical results of the elections. Fascism is extremely weak in the South. In relation to the Matteotti affair, one can say that the South has been unanimous in its condemnation of the government. This important fact shows that how artificial are the means by which fascism maintains itself in power. So, to be clear here, they didn't actually get. There weren't actually 7.3 million votes, and the fascists did not actually receive 4.7 million of them. They went in and attacked everybody who was voting for other parties, and then inserted multiple votes for each of the fascist militiamen who were going in and terrorizing people. Just normal shit. Continuing. A quick glance at the other parties which participated in the elections. Firstly, before passing to the pro-fascists, I want to recall the Nationalist Party, which is now officially wholly integrated into the Fascist Party. The Nationalist Party had been around for a long time before anyone heard of fascism, exerted a major influence on the latter's development. It was they who equipped fascism with its flimsy theoretical armory. The right wing of the liberals, with Salandra at their head, have also completely merged with fascism, and their members are candidates on the fascist list. In order to try and grab some of the seats reserved to a minority other, quote, liberal personalities and groups, not included on fascist lists, would stand beside them on a parallel list that were also purely fascist. Alongside the official lists in these parallel lists, there were liberal lists of candidates which are unofficially supported by the government. There are also others, not declaredly anti-fascist, lists such as Giolidi's towards which the government maintained a neutral stance, allowing them to win a few uncontested seats. Regarding the opposition, we need to focus first of all on the defeat of the various parliamentary parties which compose the democracy, parties which once had a powerful majority. Bonomi, extreme right-wing social reformist, wasn't re-elected. Di Cesare and Amendola only managed to salvage a small group of supporters after the government's bitter attack against them, and specifically against the latter. The Popular Party has also suffered a serious defeat. During the old parliament, it even took part in the fascist government. Its attitude has always been equivocal. It was only during the struggle against new electoral law that it made a clean break with Mussolini, who responded by getting rid of the Popolari ministers. The resulting crisis forced the party chief, Don Sturzo, to officially resign, although in fact he still continues to guide party policy. Arising from this, there has been a kind of split. A right-wing group, the Popolari Nazionali, now having left the party and support the fascist list. The main mass of the party followed Don Sturzo as before. The extreme left, headed by Migliori, has also left the party. The agitation he has been conducting in the countryside has been at times closely convergent on the actions of the revolutionary organizations. Inside the party, the influence of the big landowners still predominates in the form of Don Sturzo's mediatory centrism. The Popolari movement has undoubtedly suffered a severe blow. The Peasant Party is another small party which is worthy of note. In a couple of districts, it put forward its own list of candidates up for election. It is a party composed of discontented small farmers not prepared to entrust the representation of their interests to any of the existing parties. and preferring to form their own party. This movement may well have a future. It could achieve national prominence. The small Republican Party, which may be considered a semi proletarian party, is rather confused in its attitude, but has conducted a very vigorous campaign against the fascist movement. It has won 2 parliamentary seats. In the old House, it had 5, now it has 7 seats. Then there are the 3 parties which emerged from the old Socialist Party: the Unitarian Socialist Party, the Maximalist Socialist Party, and the Communist Party. These parties famously had 150 seats between them when united in one party. Today, the Unitarians, reformers, have 24 seats, the Maximalists 22, and the Communists 19. The Communists presented a joint list with the Third Internationalist fraction of the Maximalist Party under the banner of proletarian unity. We can say that the Communist Party was the only one of the opposition parties to return to Parliament not only with its former strength intact, but having won new seats. In 1921, we had 15 seats. Now we have 19. True, one of the seats is being contested, and the final total may be 18. That is a minor detail. In addition, for the small list of the German Slav irredentists, there's a Sardinian party, founded a few years ago in Sardinia, which doesn't actually go so far as to call for total separation from Italy, but does want increased regional autonomy. We are talking about a movement which wants the state to be decentralized and to be less tied to the Italian state and the Italian nation, and it might prompt parallel movements in other regions, which are in an even worse situation. Apparently, in Basilicata, a similar party is being formed. This movement also has certain links with the purely intellectual one, in Turin, which publishes Revolution Liberale and advocates liberal and federalist theories. This group is putting up an energetic resistance to fascism and has attracted a certain number of sympathizers from amongst intellectuals and the professional classes. As you can see, the opposition is divided up into a lot of small groups. We shall also mention here some of the political currents which don't take part in elections. There is, for example, the movement led by D'Annunzio. That is, a small elite gathered around D'Annunzio, ready to go battle when its leader gives the signal. However, D'Annunzio's attitude has been rather contradictory as of late. He has been quiet for quite a while. His was a movement born out of the previous middle class and servicemen's movement, which opposed the official mobilization of the big bourgeoisie, and which, since fascism was reneging on its program and pursuing a purely conservative course, set itself apart. Then there's the Italia Libera movement, that is the anti-fascist opposition within the servicemen's organization, who are also seeing their influence grow quite substantially at the moment. Another anti-fascist movement, which is also quite active, is Masonry. Fascism has caused a profound crisis in Masonry. There has even been a split, although it's not a very significant one, a small group of pro-fascist Masons who wanted to leave. The fascists have carried out a campaign against the Masons. Mussolini, as a fascist, got the same decision approved about the incompatibility of Masonry and party membership. They're talking about the Freemasons, for anybody confused. As he did when he was fighting for the socialists back in 1914. Masonry had lost no time in replying vigorously to these attacks. In bourgeois circles abroad, it had carried out an energetic propaganda campaign against the fascist terror. And Italy, too, is conducting educational work amongst the paid bourgeoisie and intellectuals, amongst whom Masonry is very influential. And this has not been without a certain effect. The anarchist movement doesn't play a very significant role in Italian politics at present. As you can see, the various currents opposed to a powerful fascist majority present a very complicated picture. But even if this opposition has quite a powerful press, what does it count for in terms of its military and political organization? That is, with regard to the practical possibility of mounting an attack on fascism in the near future. Practically nothing is the answer. It is true that certain groups, such as the Republicans and the Masons, would have us believe that they have legal anti-fascist organizations, but such claims are not to be taken seriously. The only thing that can be taken seriously is the strong opposition current which exists in public opinion and the press. The bourgeois opposition controls a large section of the press. These include some newspapers distributed throughout Italy, and which, whilst not declaredly of the opposition, take up a stance which is clearly against fascism. Thus do Milan's Corriere della Sera and turns La Stampa steer public opinion, above all amongst the average bourgeoisie, towards a tenacious, albeit mainly vocal, opposition. All this goes to show that dissatisfaction with fascism has grown since the latter took power. Although accurately defining and classifying the different opposition groups is quite difficult between the mood of the proletariat and that of the middle classes, it is nevertheless possible to draw a very clear line of demarcation. The proletariat is anti-fascist on the basis of its class consciousness. It sees the struggle against fascism as a mighty battle destined to make radical changes and substitute the revolutionary dictatorship to the fascist dictatorship. The proletariat is seeking revenge, but not in the banal and sentimental sense of the word. It is seeking revenge in the historical sense. The revolutionary proletariat instinctively understands that the real growth and predomination of the forces of reaction must be opposed by real counteroffensive of the forces of opposition. The proletariat senses that only after a new period of hard struggles and, if victorious, by means of the proletarian dictatorship, can currently reality be radically changed. The proletariat awaits this moment, the moment when, with redoubled zeal born of hard-won experience, it can pay back its class enemy in spades for the pummeling it is having to put up with at the moment. We're going to take this. And it's been a while since we added anything. The anti-fascism of the middle classes is of an less active character. Certainly we have before us an opposition which is strong and sincere, but is basically pacifist. What they want with all their hearts is to reestablish normal political life in Italy, and complete freedom of speech and debate, but without the use of the cudgel, without having to use violence. Everything should return to normal, both communists and fascists should have the right to profess their beliefs. Aspiring to a certain equilibrium of forces and democratic freedom, this is the illusion of the middle classes. Isn't that familiar to us all? These two attitudes, both arising from dissatisfaction with fascism, must be clearly distinguished from each other. The second attitude presents difficulties for our activity which mustn't be underestimated. Even amongst the bourgeoisie, understood in the strict sense of the word, that there are doubts about the expediency of the fascist movement. These worries they can express to a certain extent, and are two newspapers referred to earlier, which are effectively their mouthpiece. They ask themselves, is this the right method? Is it not too drastic? While it's in our class interest to have a machinery in place that can respond to certain requirements, might not be going beyond those functions and aims originally intended, might overstep the mark. The more intelligent strata of the Italian bourgeoisie are for a revision of fascism as reactionary excesses, because they fear these are bound to prompt a revolutionary explosion. Naturally, it is in the express interest of the bourgeoisie that the strata of the dominant classes are conducting a press campaign against fascism, with the aim of bringing it back onto legal terrain and turning it into a safer and more flexible weapon of class exploitation. They are in favor of the astute policy of making apparent concessions to proletariat at the same time as they express their enthusiasm for what fascism has done, for the reestablishment of the bourgeois order and for saving its underlying basis, private property. These are views which are nonetheless very influential. Basically, the big bourgeoisie are playing both sides. They are celebrating the fascists and supporting them to the hilt. At the same time, they're going and publicly condemning them and saying they're going too far. We need order, but not this kind of order. And they say that they're on the side of the proletariat in word only. So yeah. For example, Senator Agnelli, director of the biggest Italian car manufacturing firm and the most powerful of Italian capitalists, is a liberal. But when, as has happened to some of our comrades, too much is made of this fact, the Fiat workers have immediately set us straight, assuring us the reaction rules in the Fiat works exactly the same as other factories run by capitalists who belong to the fascist party. Agnelli is, after all, a tycoon, who is a very clever businessman. He knows it would be dangerous to provoke the working masses. He remembers the difficult moments he went through when the workers occupied his factories and hoisted up the red flag. He therefore gives benevolent advice to fascism on how to conduct the battle against the proletariat in a more astute way. And fascism is evidently not deaf to such advice. Before the Matoi affair, fascism had taken a turn to the left. On the eve of Matteotti's assassination, Mussolini gave a speech in which he addressed the opposition. He said, quote, "You formed the new parliament. We have never needed elections. We could have exercised the dictatorial power, but we still prefer to address the people, and you should recognize that the people have responded today by fully supporting us with an overwhelming majority." End quote. And actually, it was Matteotti who challenged this by declaring that, from a democratic and constitutional point of view, fascism had been defeated. The government had actually placed in the minority, and that its majority was contriving and misleading. Fascism, of course, refused to recognize this. Mussolini argued, quote, "Based on the official figures, we have the majority. I will now address the opposition. Opposition can be expressed in two ways. First, the communist way. To those gentlemen, we have nothing to say. They are completely logical. Their objective is to overthrow us one day through the use of revolutionary violence and install a dictatorship of the proletariat. To them we respond, we will only succumb to a superior force. You want to risk taking us on? Go ahead. To the other opposition groups, we say, the employment of revolutionary violence is not contemplated in your program. You aren't preparing an insurrection against us. What do you want then? How do you propose to take power? The law has given us 5 years as the legislature of the House, and the new elections would produce the same results. Surely the best thing then is to come to an agreement. Might we have overdone it? Maybe we have overset the mark. We have used illegal methods, which I am trying to prevent happening again. I'm inviting you to collaborate. Make your proposals, expound your thoughts. We will find a middle way." End quote. It was a call for collaboration with all non-revolutionary opposition groups. Only the communists were excluded from Mussolini's offer. He has declared that agreement with the CGIL might be possible because the latter isn't on the terrain of the demagogic theory of revolution, because Bolshevism would now be liquidated, etc. That's how things stood. The attitude taken by Mussolini showed what a force the anti-fascist opposition had become. The government could see it had needed to take a left turn. Then came the bombshell. The Matteotti affair caused the situation in Italy to completely change. The facts are well known. One day, Matteotti, the parliamentary deputy, disappears. For 2 days, his family awaits his return in vain. Then they turn to the police. The latter allege they know nothing. After the newspaper published reports about Matteotti's disappearance, eyewitnesses describe him as being attacked in the street by 5 individuals and bundled into a car, which then shoots off at great speed. Public opinion was in an uproar. Maybe Matteotti was being kept prisoner. Maybe it was a terrorist act of a lone individual. Just that or something worse, maybe assassination. The government was urged to respond. Mussolini declared immediately, "We will track down the guilty." A few arrests were made, but before long it became common knowledge that Matteotti had been killed by members of a fascist squad linked to the party's terroristic organization. The fascists immediately took this line. It's a case of regrettable gesture on the part of the illegal current we are fighting against which Mussolini has always fought. It is an individual act, a common crime. We will take action against the guilty. But public opinion wasn't too happy about it. The entire press hastened to show that the motive of the crime couldn't be purely personal, that the assassins were actually part of a secret league, a type of black band that had already on other occasions committed similar crimes of which remained unpunished because they hadn't been the same repercussions as the murder of Matteotti. More and more people were accused. Key figures of the regime started to be attacked. It had been proved that the car in question was provided by extremist fascist mouthpiece Corriere Italiano. A member of the Directory of Four, Cesare Rossi, was accused. Aldo Finzi, the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, was accused. Various well-known fascists were arrested. The anti-fascists conducted a violent press campaign. So the question is, who's responsible for the murder? Because it is undoubtedly a murder we are talking about, even if the body still hasn't been found. Is it a crime of political fanaticism? A political crime? The result again of a vendetta against Matteotti because his speech is against fascism in the Chamber of Deputies? Or is it just a case of an executive organ's mistake? The latter hypothesis, I would say, isn't ruled out. It is possible that Matteotti had to be held prisoner for a few days, and then, when he put up resistance, he was killed by the bandits who kidnapped him. Or are we dealing with something even more suspicious? It is said that Matteotti had in his possession certain documents relating to the corruption of several members of the fascist government, and he wanted to publish them. Maybe that was the reason they wanted to eliminate him. The latter hypothesis isn't very likely. Matteotti wouldn't have been so imprudent as to carry such documents around with him, and even if he had, there certainly would have been copies. Nevertheless, in the course of the press campaign, it had been established that the Ministry of Internal Affairs had become a business center in which Italian and foreign capitalists can purchase a range of concessions from the government. There has been talk of large sums of money being salted away by senior officials. One example is the Sinclair case, that is, the oil treaty which awarded a foreign company a monopoly on oil extraction in Italy. It is even said that the casino in Monte Carlo spent an enormous sum in order to push through the law restricting licenses for gaming houses in Italy. Following these allegations, the fascists even forced Finzi to immediately hand in his resignation. The question remains open: are we dealing with a political crime in the strict sense, or a crime prompted by the need to assign witnesses to a moral corruption of the fascist government? Wherever is the case, the approaches of bourgeois opposition and communist opposition to the two possibilities are very different. What does the bourgeois opposition say? For them, it is just a judicial case. It wants the government to punish the guilty. Its perspective is that the government shouldn't just restrict itself to establishing who was directly involved in the murder. The judiciary must cast light on the entire affair, calling the highly policed persons implicated in the affair, and maybe even members of the government to account. For example, General Del Bono, Supreme Chief of Police, has been accused of being involved in the murder and has been forced to resign. This shows to what level the fascist hierarchy the responsibility reaches. After all, Del Bono is one of the main leaders of the national militia. Thus, the bourgeois opposition considers the entire question as a legal matter, as a question of political morality, to re-establish in the country of social peace and tranquility, and asserts that the terror and other similar acts of violence must stop. For us, on the other hand, is a political and historical question, a question of class struggle, a crude but necessary consequence of the capitalist offensive to defend the Italian bourgeoisie. The responsibility for the fact that such horrors are possible lies with the entire fascist party, with the entire government, the entire Italian bourgeois class, and its regime. It needs to be openly proclaimed that only the revolutionary activity of the proletariat can liquidate such a situation which shows that such symptoms cannot be cured by purely legal means, with the Philistine reestablishment of law and order. In pursuance of such an aim, the urgent matter becomes instead the entire destruction of the existing order, complete overthrow which only the proletariat can see through to the end. Initially, the communists would unite in protest with the parliamentary opposition in the Chamber of Deputies. However, very soon it was necessary to draw a line of demarcation between our opposition and theirs. The communists haven't participated in the last declaration of the other parties. I'm going to add that. Even the Maximalists are represented in the Committee of the Parliamentary Opposition. Apropos, we need to point out the very characteristic event. The Communist Party, as a protest action against the Matteotti murder, had immediately proposed a countrywide general strike in Italy. Spontaneous strikes had already broken out in a number of cities, which showed that the proposal was serious and practical. The other parties, with the approval of the Maximalists, instead proposed a 10-minute strike as a protest action in honor of Matteotti. But the Reformists, Maximalists, CGIL, and other opposition groups would suffer the great misfortune of having industrial confederations and fascist trade unions immediately accepting the proposal, and officially joining with the opposition. Thus, of course, did the protest lose any trace of class significance. Today it is clear as daylight that the communists are the only ones to make the proposal which would have allowed the proletariat to influence events in a decisive way. What is the outlook for the Mussolini government in the present situation? Before the latest events occurred, we had been forced to recognize, despite striking evidence of a growing discontent with fascism, that its military and state organization was nonetheless powerful enough to prevent the appearance of a force capable of working practically for the overthrow of fascism in the near future. Discontent was growing, but we were still a long way from a crisis situation. Recent events provide a striking example of how small causes determine great effects. The Matteotti murder sped up the developing situation to an extraordinary degree, even if, of course, social conditions already meant the premises of the development existed in latent form. The rhythm of the fascist crisis has been greatly accelerated. The fascist government has suffered a damaging defeat from a moral, psychological, and in a certain sense, also from the political point of view. This defeat hasn't yet had repercussions at the level of the political, military, and administrative organization, but it is clear that a moral and political defeat such as this is a first step towards further unraveling of the crisis and the struggle for power. The government had to make notable concessions, such as surrendering the internal affairs portfolio to old nationalist chief, now fascist, Federazione. Other concessions have also been made too, but fascism still keeps power firmly in its hands. In his speeches to the Senate, Mussolini has openly declared that he will hold on to his post and deploy all means of power at his disposal against anyone who attacks him. According to the latest news, the wave of public indignation has still not abated. However, the situation has become objectively more stable. The National Militia was mobilized 2 days after Matteotti murder had already been demobilized, and its members have returned to their usual occupations. This indicates that the government perceives the immediate danger as having passed, but that over major upheavals could happen in a very near future looks far more of a possibility than it did before the Matteotti crisis. What is nevertheless clear is that in future fascism will be much more difficult position, and that the practical possibilities for future anti-fascist action, depending on what happens in the intervening period, are now different than before. How should we respond to this new situation which is so unexpectedly arisen? I will give a systematic outline of my view. The Communist Party must emphasize the independent role which the situation in Italy has assigned to it, and issue watchwords with the following content: liquidation of the anti fascist opposition groups and their substitution with direct and open action of the communist movement. Today, we are faced with events that are causing the spotlight of public interest to focus on the Communist Party. For a while, after the taking of power by the fascists, there were mass arrests of our comrades. It was said then that the communist and Bolshevik forces had been annihilated, dispersed, that the revolutionary movement had been completely liquidated. But for quite a while after the elections and other events, the party has been given signs of life, which are far too strong to support these assertions. In all of his speeches, Mussolini is compelled to refer to the communists. In the controversy over the Matteotti case, the fascist press has had to defend itself every day and take up a position against the communists. We're going to take this. Okay. And then continuing, this causes attention to be focused on our party, and on its particular duty of retaining its independence from all those other closely linked opposition groups. Our party, having taken up its particular standpoint, draws a clear line of demarcation between itself and these other groups. Besides, thanks to its experience of class struggle in Italy during and after the war, and thanks also to the bitter disillusionment it has suffered, the Italian proletariat knows that there needs to be a complete liquidation of all the social democratic currents from the bourgeois left to the proletarian right, and this awareness is firmly entrenched. All these currents have had the practical possibility of taking action and proving themselves. Experience has shown that none of them are up to the task. The vanguard of the revolutionary proletariat, the Communist Party, is the only one which is refusing to give up. This is entirely the case, by the way. A reminder on who finally fucking killed Mussolini, thank goodness. It was the communists that were the partisans. The communists that continued to fight and finally won, for that matter. Again, an internal execution of Mussolini and his fellow fascist assholes. But then, of course, they were stopped by British troops from actually full carrying out the rest of it. I'm not too certain about the contents of that, but anyway, to be clear, what he's saying isn't, you know, align with fascists attack the social democrats. That'd be aligning with the social democrats attack the social democrats. What he's saying is the Communist Party needs to remain independent. If they're going to join in with any organization, it needs to be clear that the Communist Party is the one is out. It's doing its own thing, and put specific requirements for people to be a part of that. It's saying that these very social democratic organizations are ultimately not up to task to fight the fascists, and that is historically very clearly been the case. Um, so they have to actually engage in direct struggle. Continuing. But in order to be able to follow an independent political line, it is absolutely indispensable that defeatism be expunged from the party. We cannot tell Italian proletarians who have faith in the party and its strength that the actions attempted by communists up to now add up to failure and lack of success. If our practice shows that the party can organize and de-struggle and implement an autonomous tactic of its own, if our practice shows that the party lives on as the unique opposition party, if we can issue appropriate watchwords which indicate a practical way of going on the offensive, it is then that we will achieve our aim of liquidating the opposition groups, and primarily the socialists and maximalists. That is the direction which we should go in my opinion, in order to take advantage of the present situation. Reminder that the socialists and maximalists entered into compact with Mussolini in the same way that the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, in Germany aligned with Hitler ultimately. We're going to take this. In order to work towards that, we shouldn't, however, restrict ourselves to polemics. Practical work needs to be done to conquer the masses. The purpose of this work is a unitary joining together of the masses for revolutionary action, the united front of the proletariat of city and country under the leadership of the Communist Party. Only with this unitary joining together will we have achieved the condition which allows us to engage in the direct struggle with fascism. This is a major task, which can and must be carried out whilst retaining the party's independence. And I just want to remind everybody that in the course of the struggle, especially in modern times, all countries will respond to any sort of communist movement, any sort of serious socialist movement with fascism. It is a tried and true strategy that has been utilized across the globe, either created internally by the national bourgeoisie of a nation or externally, as in, for example, Pinochet, who was put in place by America. So you must come from the automatic assumption that when class struggle occurs and the proletariat starts winning it, the bourgeoisie will pull out fascism from their asses, pulling out from it the recesses of the most shitty people you can imagine. And yeah, so you just have to be aware of that. And that means that we have to do this. We have to automatically assume that we need to build these sorts of to join the masses for revolutionary action. We have to create unity. We need to take control over the cities and the country. This isn't really negotiable. And by the way, fascism will come whether or not the proletariat starts to rise anyway, because as capitalism decays, as it always does, as profit rates decrease and the like, fascist violence will come out in order to remind the people who they serve. And the only question there is, are we prepared to deal with it? Continuing. It is possible, following the Matteotti affair, that fascism will unleash a, quote, second wave of terror, a new offensive against the opposition. But this will just be another episode of the escalating situation. We might see the opposition retreating and a decline in the public expression of discontent as a result of this new terror. In time, however, discontent will start to build up again, and so will the opposition. Fascism cannot hold on to power by means of continuous, incessant pressure. Another possibility, however, exists. The working masses being brought together on the initiative of the Communist Party under the banner of the reconstitution of the Red trade unions. Maybe it will soon be possible to begin this task. Reminder that the reason why it specifies red is because the yellow trade unions were pretty much universally the fascist trade unions. The opportunists don't dare undertake this task. There are cities in Italy where we could be assured of success if we invited the workers to rejoin the red unions. But since its return would at the same time be a sign of struggle, because we have been ready at the same time to fight the fascists, the opportunist parties have been in no hurry to reconstitute the proletariat's mass organizations. If the Communist Party were the first to take advantage of the favorable moment and issue this watchword, there would be the possibility of the Italian labor movement reorganizing around the Communist Party at its center. Even before the situation created by the Matteotti affair, our independent stance was the best maneuver we could have performed. For example, during the elections, even non-communist elements voted for communist candidates because they saw in communism what they would refer to as the clearest and most radical form of anti-fascism, the clearest rejection of what they hated. Our independent position is therefore a means to exercise a political influence even on those strata which aren't directly linked to us. It's precisely to this fact that we have presented ourselves with an unequivocal program that we owe the Communist Party's major success in the elections, despite the government offensive unleashed primarily against our candidates and our electoral campaign. We officially campaigned under the slogan, quote, proletarian unity, end quote. But the masses gave us their votes because we were communists, because we openly declared war on fascism, because our adversaries defined us as irreconcilable. This stance has ensured us notable successes. The same goes for the Matteotti incident. All eyes are turned on the Communist Party, which speaks a language which is completely different to any other opposition party, from which it follows that only entirely independent and radical stance towards not only fascism, but also the opposition, will allow us to take advantage of the current developments in order to overthrow the monstrous power of fascism. A similar work must be carried out to win over the peasant masses. We need to elaborate a form of organization of the peasantry, which will allow us to work not only amongst waged farm laborers, who essentially take the same line as industrial wage earners, but also amongst tenant farmers, smallholders, etc., within the organizations which defend their interests. The economic situation is such that no amount of pressure will be able to prevent the formation of such organizations. We need to try and raise this issue with the small peasant proprietors and put forward a clear program which addresses their oppression and expropriation. We need to represent a clean break with the ambiguous stance taken by the Socialist Party in this field. We need to utilize the existing currents in order to form peasant organizations and direct them onto the road of the defense of the economic interests of the rural population. Indeed, if these organizations are transformed into electoral machines, they will fall into the hands of bourgeois agitators, politicians, and advocates of the small towns and villages. If we manage to instead breathe life into an organization for the defense of the economic interests of the peasantry, not a trade union, because in theory the idea of a trade union of small proprietors encounters serious objections, we would have an association at our disposal within which we could carry out group work, which would be influenced by us, and within which we could find a point of support for the coalition of the rural and urban proletariat under the sole direction of the Communist Party. We're going to take this. Continuing, this is not a terrorist program which is being presented. Legends have been created around us. It has been said that we actually want to be a minority party, to be a small elite, and so on and so forth. We have never supported such notions. If there is one movement, both through its critique and tactics, which has worked relentlessly to destroy any illusions about terrorist minorities spread around by ultra anarchists and syndicalists, that movement is our party. We have always been opposed to that tendency, and it really is turning things on their head to portray us as terrorists and supporters of actions by armed, heroic minorities and all that goes with it. Not like racial minorities, like a minority group of people that is broken from the masses. Continuing. We do, however, take that as regards the problem of the disarmament of the White Guards and the arming of the proletariat, a topic of much concern to the party today, it is necessary to take a clear and principled stand. Certainly, a struggle is possible if the masses take part in it. The majority of the proletariat knows full well that an attack by a heroic vanguard will not resolve matters. The latter is an ingenious solution and should be rejected that's not ingenious. That's an ingenuous solution. Uh, and innocent and unsuspecting. Okay. The latter is an innocent and unsuspecting solution, and it should be rejected by all Marxist parties. However, if we go to the masses with the watchword of disarmament of the White Guards and arming of the proletariat, these same working masses have to be presented in an active role. We must dispel the illusion that a, quote, transitional government, end quote, would ever be so naive to allow bourgeois positions to be outflanked by legal means, by parliamentary maneuvering and clever expedients. In other words, would allow legal taking possession of the entire technical and military machinery of the bourgeoisie and the peaceful distribution of arms to the proletariat. And with that done, have us quietly give the signal to revolt. This is really a silly and childish idea. Launching the revolution isn't that easy. In other words, they're saying you can't just go in and through electoral systems have the tools to destroy the master's house just be given to you. Right? Um yeah, we're just utilizing legal struggle isn't, it'll get you some places, but it won't get you all the way on any level. Continue. We are absolutely convinced of the impossibility of embarking on the struggle with a few hundred or so, or even a few thousand armed communists. The Communist Party of Italy is the last one to succumb to such illusions. We are firmly convinced of the absolute necessity of drawing the great masses into the struggle. But getting armed is a problem that can only be resolved by revolutionary means. We can take advantage of the slowing down of fascism's development by creating revolutionary proletarian formations. But we have to destroy the illusion that maneuvers of any kind may put us one day in such a position that we could take over the bourgeoisie's technical and military machinery. In other words, tie our enemies' hands in order to go on and attack them. To fight illusion which induces in the proletariat a sense of revolutionary apathy isn't terrorism. On the contrary, is a stance which is genuinely Marxist and revolutionary. We are not saying that we are that we are the communist, quote, elite, that we want to overturn the social equilibrium with the action of a small minority. Not at all. We want to conquer the leadership of the proletarian masses. We want unity in proletarian action. But we do also want to utilize the experiences of the Italian proletariat, and these have taught us that the struggles which are led by a non-consolidated party, even if it is a mass party, or one composed of an improvised coalition of parties, leads necessarily to defeat. We want a joint struggle of the working masses of the city and country, but we want this struggle to be led by a general staff with a clear political line, that is to say, the Communist Party. This is the problem we are confronting. I'll take that. Continuing, the situation will unfold in a way which is more or less complicated, but there already exists the premises for the issuing of watchwords and agitation around the Communist Party initiating and guiding the revolution and declaring openly that it is necessary to march forward over the ruins of existing fascist opposition groups. The proletariat must be warned that when taking the power by the working class in Italy presents itself as a real danger to the capitalist class, all the bourgeois and social democratic forces will align around fascism. This carried out historically. These are the prospects for the battle which we must prepare for in advance. To conclude, I want to add a few words of fascism as an international phenomenon based on the experiences we have had in Italy. We believe that fascism wants to spread beyond Italy as well. Similar movements in other countries such as Bulgaria, Hungary, and maybe also in Germany have probably been supported by Italian fascism. But if it is certainly true that the proletariat of the entire world need to understand and utilize the lessons learned about fascism in Italy, in case similar movements are formed in other countries as means of fighting the workers, one shouldn't, however, forget that in Italy there existed some particular presuppositions which allowed the fascist movement to become such a gigantic force. First and foremost, amongst these presuppositions, I will recall national and religious unity. To get the middle class to mobilize around fascism, I now believe that both presuppositions are indispensable. A sentimentalist mobilization has to be based on both national and religious unity. Evidently, the formation of a large fascist party in Germany would come up against the presence of two different religious confessions, the different nationalities with tendencies which are in part separatist. In Italy, fascism found exceptionally favorable premises. Italy was among the victorious states, and whilst an overcharged state of chauvinism and patriotism existed there, at the same time the material advantages of victory were less in evidence. Strictly connected to this factor is the defeat of the proletariat. The middle classes bided their time for a while to see whether or not the proletariat would be powerful enough to win. When the revolutionary power parties of the proletariat showed their impotence, the middle classes then believed that they could act independently and take the government into their own hands. In the meantime, the big bourgeoisie took the opportunity to subjugate these forces and to yoke them to the cart of its own interests. Based on these facts, I don't believe we should yet expect to appear in other countries a fascism as open and blatant as one in Italy. Fascism in the sense of a unitary movement of the upper strata of the exploiters and of a mobilization of a large majority of the middle classes and pay bourgeois in the interests of these strata. Fascism in other countries is different than in Italy. In these countries, it is just a pay bourgeois movement with a reactionary ideology which is purely pay bourgeois and with some armed formations. A movement which, however, isn't completely identified with big business and particularly the state machine. This state machine can rather enter into a coalition with the parties of big business, the major banks and large landed property, but towards the middle class and the pay bourgeois, it more or less retains its independence. Clearly, this kind of fascism is an enemy of the proletariat as well, but is a much less dangerous enemy than Italian fascism. The question of relations with such a movement is, as far as I'm concerned, fully resolved. It is madness to think of having any link with it. Such a movement, in fact, offers the basis for a counter revolutionary political mobilization of the semi proletarian masses. If the actual proletariat were to be brought to act on the same basis, it would present grave dangers. But in general terms, we can expect a broad in general terms, we can expect abroad a copy of Italian fascism which will hybridize with the various manifestations of the quote democratic and pacifist wave end quote. But fascism will take different forms to that in Italy. The reaction and capitalist offensive of the various strata in conflict with the proletariat will not submit to such a unitary direction. Much has been said about the foreign organizations of Italian anti fascism. These organizations have been created by bourgeois Italian immigrants. However, how Italian fascism is viewed by the international public opinion and the propaganda campaign conducted against it by civilized countries is also the order of the day. This moral indignation by the bourgeoisie of other countries is seen even as a means of liquidating the fascist movement. Communists and revolutionaries mustn't give in to the illusion of the democratic and moral sensitivity of the bourgeoisie of the other countries. Even where pacifist and left wing tendencies still exist today, tomorrow they will have no scruples to get about using fascism as a weapon in the class struggle. We know that the exploits of fascism in Italy and the campaign of terror it has conducted there against the workers can only give cause for rejoicing to international capital. In the fight against fascism, it is only the Revolutionary Proletarian International which can be defended on. It is a question of class struggle. We don't turn to help from the democratic parties in other countries, or to associations of idiots and hypocrites like the League of the Rights of Man, because we don't want to give succor to the illusion that they differ in some substantial way from fascism, or that the bourgeoisie in other countries isn't just as capable of preparing for its own working class the same persecutions and carrying out the same atrocities as fascism in Italy. There is to be an uprising against Italian fascism and a campaign against the terror in our countries. There's only one force to be counted on: the revolutionary forces in Italy and abroad. It needs the workers of every land to boycott the Italian fascists. Those of our comrades who have been persecuted and exiled abroad in the course of the struggle will not be as indifferent to this battle, nor to the creation amongst the proletariat of an international anti fascist state of mind. The reaction and terror in Italy should arouse a class hatred, a proletarian counteroffensive which will give rise to an international convergence of the revolutionary forces of the world scale against international fascism, against all other forms of bourgeois oppression. And that is the text of the Italian Communist Party report on fascism by the left of the Communist Party of Italy. And that was presented by Bordiga as the next part of the report on fascism given 2 years prior. So next up, we will be reading the 1926 Communist Party of Italy Third Congress line, theses presented by the left.